The massive crystal dome of the Galactic Coalition chambers gleamed under the light of 3 suns. Representatives from 12 different alien species sat in their designated areas, each breathing their own atmosphere through personal life support systems. The air hummed with translators working overtime to convert dozens of languages into something everyone could understand. Ambassador Zektor of the Saurian Empire shifted his weight on his tail as he watched the debate unfold. His reptilian features remained calm, but inside his mind raced with memories he wished he could forget. The topic today was simple enough on the surface, but deadly complicated underneath. What should the Coalition do about the humans? Commander Velnari stood at the center podium, her crystalline body catching and reflecting light as she spoke. The ethereal collective had sent their best military mind to make the case for action. Her voice rang clear through the translation systems as she presented her argument to the assembled representatives. The humans had been expanding into the Outer Rim territories for the past 5 years. Their colony ships kept pushing further from their home system, claiming planets and building settlements. To Velnari, this was a clear sign of aggressive expansion that threatened the established order of galactic civilization. She pulled up holographic displays showing human ship movements and colony locations. The numbers seemed small compared to other spacefaring races. But the pattern worried her. Humans moved with purpose and determination that reminded her of invasive species she had studied in xenobiology classes. Elder Mordak of the Hive Mind clicked his mandibles in agreement as Velnari spoke. His insectoid race had built their civilization on careful planning and controlled expansion. The human approach seemed chaotic and dangerous to him. He had reviewed intelligence reports about human technology and found it primitive compared to Coalition standards. Human weapons still used projectile ammunition instead of energy beams. Their ships relied on fusion reactors rather than antimatter cores. Their shields were basic electromagnetic barriers that any serious military force could penetrate with ease. From a technological standpoint, they appeared to be centuries behind. The average Coalition member, Velnari continued her presentation by showing tactical analyses of human military capabilities. Their largest warship was barely half the size of a Coalition cruiser. Their total fleet numbered in the hundreds, while Coalition members fielded thousands of vessels. The math seemed simple enough to her military mind. Dr. Cathara from the Cerebral Union provided psychological profiles of human behavior patterns. His species had spent decades studying other races to understand their motivations and predict their actions. According to his research, humans made decisions based on emotion rather than logic. This made them unpredictable in some ways, but also gave them exploitable weaknesses. The debate continued for hours as different representatives voiced their opinions. Some agreed with Velnari that swift action was necessary to contain human expansion before it became a real threat. Others argued for diplomatic solutions or economic pressure to keep humans in line. Throughout all of this, Ambassador Zektor remained silent. He listened to every argument and watched every display with growing unease. These representatives were making the same mistakes his people had made 50 years ago. They were looking at numbers and technology without understanding what really mattered about humans. Finally, High Chancellor Kixran called for any remaining testimony before the vote. The chamber fell quiet as representatives prepared to make their final decision. That was when Zektor rose from his seat and requested permission to address the council. A few representatives groaned softly. The Saurian Empire was considered a second-tier power these days, weakened by decades of military failures and economic problems. Many Coalition members saw them as cautionary examples rather than valuable allies. Velnari objected to hearing more testimony, arguing that they had already covered all relevant facts about human capabilities and intentions. She wanted to move directly to the vote while momentum favored her position. But High Chancellor Kixran was curious about what the Saurians might add to the discussion. The Saurian Empire had been one of the first coalition members to encounter humans in space. Their experience might provide useful insights that pure intelligence analysis had missed. Zektor walked slowly to the central podium, his clawed feet clicking against the crystal floor. He looked around the chamber at faces that showed everything from mild interest to open skepticism. These beings had no idea what they were considering. He began his testimony with a simple statement that caught everyone's attention. 50 years. Ago, his people had made the same calculations and reached the same conclusions about human military weakness. The Saurian Empire had been at the height of its power then, with advanced technology and a proud military tradition. The humans had seemed like easy targets when their first deep space colony ship entered what the Saurians considered their territory. One primitive vessel carrying 2,000 civilians should have been a simple matter to deal with. The mathematics of the situation had been overwhelmingly in Saurian favor. Zektor paused and looked directly at Velnari before delivering his warning. The Saurians had attacked that human ship and won the battle easily. Every human aboard had died, just as the tactical projections had predicted. But winning that battle had cost the Saurian Empire everything that truly mattered. He requested permission to share classified details about what happened after their victory over the humans. Despite objections from several representatives who wanted to move to the vote, High Chancellor Kixron granted his request. The chamber fell completely silent as Zektor prepared to tell them about the Kepler incident. The story he was about to tell would change how every representative thought about humanity. It would reveal why the Saurian Empire lived in fear and why attacking humans was the worst mistake any species could make. But first, he had to take them back 50 years to show them how it all began. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Discovery as it dropped out of faster-than-light travel near the fourth planet of the Kepler 442 system. The massive colony ship had been humanity's home for the past 18 months as they traveled from Earth to establish their first deep space settlement. 2,000 people had put their faith in this mission and in Jake's ability to lead them safely to their new world. The planet looked perfect from orbit, with blue oceans and green continents that reminded everyone of Earth. Preliminary scans showed breathable atmosphere, reasonable gravity, and no signs of intelligent life. After months of cramped quarters and recycled air, the colonists were eager to feel real ground under their feet again. Dr. Lisa Morrison worked in the medical bay, preparing equipment for the planetary survey teams. As the mission's chief medical officer and Jake's wife, she carried double responsibility for keeping everyone healthy and safe. Their 8-year-old daughter Emma helped by organizing supply containers and asking endless questions about their new home. The Discovery had been designed for long-term colonization rather than military action. Its weapons consisted of basic defensive systems meant to deal with asteroids or space debris. The ship's primary purpose was to carry everything needed to build a thriving human settlement far from Earth. 3 days into their orbital surveys, the Discovery's sensors detected incoming ships. 5 vessels approached from the outer system, moving with the precision of a military formation. Jake ordered his communications officer to send standard first contact protocols, broadcasting messages of peaceful intent in multiple languages, and mathematical sequences. War Commander Thekmar of the Saurian Imperial Navy received these transmissions aboard his flagship. His patrol had been checking border systems when they detected the unknown vessel. The ship appeared primitive by Saurian standards, with crude fusion drives and basic metal hull construction. Its weapons were almost laughably weak compared to proper military hardware. Thekmar had spent his career expanding Saurian territory by eliminating threats before they could grow strong enough to challenge the Empire. He viewed the human ship as exactly the kind of problem that needed immediate solution. One weak species today could become a dangerous enemy tomorrow if allowed to establish a foothold in space. The war commander ignored the human peace messages and ordered his ships to attack positions. His tactical officers reported that the enemy Vessel had minimal shielding and weapons that posed no threat to Saurian warships. The battle would be over quickly with minimal risk to his own forces. Jake tried desperately to communicate as the alien ships approached in attack formation. He broadcast on every frequency, sent mathematical proofs of intelligence, even had his daughter Emma speak a simple greeting that might touch whatever compassion these beings possessed. Nothing worked. The first Saurian plasma bolts struck the Discovery's forward sections, overwhelming the defensive screens and tearing through hull plating like paper. Explosions rocked the ship as power systems failed and atmosphere began venting into space. Jake ordered all civilians to emergency shelters while his small crew tried to return fire with their inadequate weapons. Lisa Morrison rushed through, corridors filled with smoke and sparking electronics to reach the children's section. Dozens of young colonists huddled in fear as the ship shook around them. She began moving them toward the more heavily protected emergency pods while explosions continued to tear through their home. The Discovery's weapons managed to score a few hits on the attacking ships, but did no significant damage. Thekmar's forces methodically destroyed the human ship's engines, life support, and communication systems. They wanted to disable rather than destroy, planning to board and capture any survivors for interrogation. But human engineering proved more fragile than Saurian calculations had predicted. A plasma strike intended to disable the reactor instead caused a cascade failure that destroyed the entire power grid. Life support throughout the ship died instantly, leaving 2,000 people breathing poison gas in the dark. Lisa shielded a group of children with her own body as toxic fumes filled their compartment. She used her medical scanner to find the youngest victims first, giving them her personal oxygen supply until she collapsed from suffocation. Emma died holding her mother's hand as the Discovery turned into a tomb around them. Jake managed to activate an emergency beacon before the bridge lost power completely. His final transmission contained full tactical data about the attacking ships, along with a message that would haunt the galaxy for decades to come. With his dying breath, he whispered words that his communications officer recorded and broadcast into space. "Remember them all," he said, as darkness claimed the Discovery and everyone aboard. War Commander Thekmar ordered his ships to scan for survivors, but found none. The human vessel had become a lifeless hulk drifting in space with no signs of functional life support or escape pods. His tactical officer reported mission success with 0 Saurian casualties and complete elimination of the unknown threat. The war commander filed his report describing the encounter as a minor border incident. Unknown aliens had attempted to establish an illegal colony in Saurian space and were dealt with according to standard military protocols. He recommended increased patrols to prevent similar incursions in the future. Thekmar felt satisfied with his victory as his ships returned to Saurian space. He had protected the Empire from potential enemies and demonstrated Saurian military superiority. The brief battle had been so one-sided that he barely considered it worth mentioning in his personal log. 3 months later, a human rescue fleet arrived at the Kepler system following Jake's distress beacon. They found the Discovery, drifting dead in space with its hull torn open and its cargo hold scattered across local space. Search teams worked for weeks to recover bodies and piece together what had happened. Among the few survivors they found in an escape pod was Lieutenant Commander Ryan Clark, Jake's first officer. He had been unconscious for months, but his pod's medical systems had kept him alive. When he finally woke up in a hospital ship, he carried with him the complete tactical recordings of the battle and Jake's final message. The rescue fleet commander sent a priority transmission back to Earth, containing everything they had learned. The message was simple, but would change human history forever. An unknown alien race had attacked and murdered 2,000 innocent colonists without provocation or warning. Earth's first attempt at peaceful deep space colonization had ended in massacre. Ryan Clark stared at the wreckage of his former home and made a promise that would echo across the galaxy. The aliens responsible for this atrocity would face justice, no matter how long it took or how far they ran. Humanity would remember every victim and hunt down every killer until the debt was paid in full. Admiral Susan Hayes stood before the United Earth Assembly in the Great Hall where humanity made its most important decisions. Behind her, a massive display showed images from the Discovery wreckage and the faces of 2,000 murdered colonists. The silence in the chamber was complete, as representatives absorbed the full horror of what had happened to their people. The aliens had not bothered with warnings or negotiations. They had simply appeared and begun killing every human they could find. Children, scientists, farmers, teachers, and engineers had all died the same way, suffocated in the dark as their home was torn apart around them. The attack had been methodical and thorough, designed to leave no survivors who might report back to Earth. Admiral Hayes had spent 40 years building Earth's space defense forces, from a handful of experimental ships to a proper interstellar navy. She had always known that humanity would eventually encounter hostile aliens, but she had hoped their first contact would involve some attempt at communication. Instead, they had learned that the galaxy contained species that viewed humans as nothing more than pests to be eliminated. The Assembly voted unanimously to authorize whatever response Admiral Hayes deemed necessary. They gave her unlimited resources and complete authority to deal with the alien threat. The message was clear from every human government on Earth. This massacre would not go unanswered. Hayes immediately began implementing plans she had developed for exactly this scenario. The new Retribution fleet would be built specifically for long-range operations against technologically superior enemies. Instead of trying to match alien technology, human ships would focus on speed, stealth, and endurance. They would become the wolves of space, hunting their prey across the galaxy until justice was served. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Clark recovered slowly from his injuries while Earth mobilized for war. The medical teams had repaired his body, but his mind carried memories that would never heal. He had watched his friends and shipmates die helplessly, while aliens destroyed everything they had worked to build. The sound of Emma Morrison's final transmission still echoed in his dreams. Clark volunteered to lead the hunt for the aliens responsible for the massacre. His tactical recordings from the Discovery provided the only detailed information about enemy ships and capabilities. More importantly, he carried something else that made him perfect for the mission: absolute certainty that the killers would be found and punished. The Retribution fleet launched 2 years after the Kepler incident, with Clark commanding the lead ship UES Vengeance. Unlike the Discovery, these vessels were built for war with advanced stealth systems, powerful engines, and weapons designed to penetrate alien defenses. Each ship carried enough supplies for years of independent operation in hostile space. Finding: the aliens proved easier than expected. The tactical data from Clark's recordings contained unique electromagnetic signatures from the enemy ship's power systems. Human scientists had spent months analyzing these patterns and developing sensors that could detect them across interstellar distances. The killers had left electronic fingerprints at the crime scene. The trail led to a star system controlled by the Saurian Empire, a reptilian species that claimed territory across dozens of star systems. Intelligence gathered from captured communications revealed that War Commander Thekmar had filed a routine report about eliminating an illegal colony ship. To the Saurians, the massacre had been nothing more than standard border enforcement. Clark studied everything Earth's spies could learn about Saurian society and military structure. He memorized the names and service records of every officer who had participated in the attack. The 5 ships that destroyed the Discovery were identified along with their current locations and patrol schedules. The hunt could finally begin. Thackeray. First target was the cruiser Scaloneth, commanded by Captain Vortak, who had personally fired the shots that killed the Discovery's life support systems. Clark's ships tracked the Saurian vessel for 3 weeks, learning its habits and waiting for the perfect opportunity. When Skalnith separated from its escort to investigate what appeared to be a derelict freighter, the humans struck. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes. Human missiles penetrated Saurian shields with ease, while their return fire missed the stealthed human ships completely. The Skalnith died with all hands, its wreckage scattered across space as a message to anyone who might be watching. The wolves had found their prey. War Commander Thekmar received news of the attack with confusion rather than concern. Pirates occasionally struck isolated ships, and the Skalnith had been operating in a dangerous region. He ordered increased patrols and better escort protocols to prevent future incidents. The possibility that unknown enemies were hunting his ships never occurred to him. The second kill came a month later when the destroyer Hektar was found drifting empty with its crew missing. Security recordings showed human soldiers boarding the ship and systematically capturing every Saurian aboard. The attackers had worn no uniforms and left no identification, but their efficiency suggested military training and planning. Clark interrogated the Hektar survivors in a secret facility hidden in an asteroid field. He wanted information about Saurian military operations and the current locations of remaining targets. The aliens eventually provided everything he asked for, though some required more persuasion than others. When the questioning was complete, Clark had them executed for their crimes against humanity. The pattern continued for months as human forces picked off Saurian ships one by one. Each attack was carefully planned to avoid direct confrontation, with superior numbers while maximizing psychological impact on the enemy. The Saurians began to realize they were being hunted by an organized force rather than random pirates. Thekmar found his command slowly dissolving as ships disappeared or were found destroyed. His remaining captains became nervous and paranoid, jumping at sensor ghosts and requesting constant reinforcement. The humans were fighting a war of nerves as much as a military campaign, using fear as a weapon to weaken their enemies before striking. The war commander finally understood what was happening when he received a transmission from the humans. Captain Clark appeared on his communication screen wearing the uniform of an Earth military officer. Behind him stood captured Saurian prisoners who had participated in the Discovery Massacre. The message was simple and terrifying in its implications. Clark identified himself as a survivor of the Kepler incident and formally charged Thekmar with murder and genocide. The human demanded surrender and trial for war crimes committed against innocent colonists. In exchange, he offered to spare the remaining Saurian ships and their crews. The alternative was continuation of the hunt until every participant in the massacre was dead. Thekmar rejected the human demands and ordered his fleet to concentrate for a decisive battle. He had grown tired of running from inferior enemies and wanted to end this conflict with overwhelming force. The war commander gathered his remaining ships and prepared to show these primitive aliens the true power of the Saurian Empire. War Commander Thekmar assembled his remaining fleet in the Vega system, choosing a location where the humans would have to approach through open space with no cover. His tactical officers had analyzed every previous engagement and identified patterns in human attack strategies. This time, they would be ready for anything the aliens might attempt. The Saurian force consisted of 12 warships, including Thekmar's flagship, the dreadnought Sektar. Each vessel carried advanced sensors and weapon systems that should have been more than adequate to deal with primitive human technology. The war commander was confident that superior firepower would end this embarrassing conflict once and for all. Captain Ryan Clark approached the Vega system with only 3 ships, seemingly walking into an obvious trap. His sensors detected the waiting Saurian fleet exactly where intelligence reports had predicted they would be. Thekmar was following standard military doctrine by concentrating his forces and choosing favorable terrain for the engagement. But Clark had not come to fight a conventional battle. The past year of hunting individual Saurian ships had taught him everything he needed to know about their technology and tactics. More importantly, It had given him time to prepare weapons specifically designed to exploit Saurian weaknesses. The human ships broadcast surrender signals as they approached the Saurian fleet, appearing to accept defeat in the face of overwhelming odds. Thekmar ordered his forces to maintain attack positions while preparing to accept the enemy surrender. He wanted to capture the human commander alive for interrogation about Earth's military capabilities. That was when Clark revealed his true strategy. The approaching human ships were not carrying his main force, but were instead massive bombs disguised as warships. Each vessel contained thousands of tons of antimatter in magnetic containment bottles rigged to detonate when the containment failed. The crews had evacuated hours earlier using stealth pods that Saurian sensors could not detect. The explosions vaporized half of Thekmar's fleet instantly, while the electromagnetic pulses disabled most of the surviving ships. In the chaos that followed, Clark's real attack force emerged from stealth and began systematically destroying the crippled Saurian vessels. The battle that Thekmar had planned turned into a massacre of his own forces. The war commander managed to escape with 2 damaged ships while the rest of his fleet died around him. His flagship's engines were failing and life support was operating on emergency power. Worse, the humans were already pursuing him with ships that seemed unaffected by the battle damage that had crippled his own forces. Thekmar fled towards Saurian space, hoping to reach reinforcements before the humans could finish him. His tactical officer reported that the pursuing ships were maintaining perfect formation despite traveling at maximum speed. These aliens fought with a precision and determination that reminded him of hunting predators from his homeworld. The chase continued for 3 days across 2 star systems. Every time Thekmar thought he had gained distance, the human ships appeared again like ghosts, materializing from empty space. Their stealth technology was far superior to anything in Saurian databases, and their endurance seemed unlimited. When his engines finally failed completely, Thekmar made a desperate decision that would define how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. He ordered his surviving ship to dock with a Saurian civilian transport that was carrying 300 non-combatants, including families and children. If the humans wanted him, they would have to attack innocent civilians to get him. Clark received the war commander's transmission explaining the situation. Thekmar demanded safe passage to Saurian space in exchange for the lives of the civilian hostages. Any attack on his ship would result in the deaths of hundreds of innocent beings who had nothing to do with the Kepler incident. The human response shocked the Saurian war commander and everyone else who was monitoring the situation. Clark's ships approached the civilian transport and requested permission to board for a peaceful resolution. When Thekmar refused, the humans simply began cutting through the hull with precision tools that avoided damaging life support systems. Human soldiers in powered armor moved through the transport with surgical precision. They identified and eliminated every armed Saurian while carefully protecting all civilian passengers. Medical teams treated the wounded while engineers repaired damage caused by the boarding action. Within 2 hours, the transport was secure with all civilians safe and unharmed. Thekmar found himself alone in his command center, facing Captain Clark and a squad of human soldiers. The war commander still carried his sidearm and could have chosen to die fighting, but something in the human's eyes convinced him that resistance was pointless. These aliens fought with a cold efficiency that reminded him more of machines than living beings. Clark personally placed restraints on the Saurian officer while reading him formal charges for the murder of 2,000 human colonists. The war commander would be transported back to Earth for trial and execution, but first he would provide information about other participants in the massacre. The hunt was far from over. The trial of War Commander Thekmar was broadcast across human space and beyond. Survivors from the Discovery wreckage testified about watching their families die while Saurian weapons tore their ship apart. The war commander offered no defense except to claim he had been following standard military orders when dealing with illegal aliens in Saurian territory. Admiral Hayes personally announced Thekmar's sentence after the trial concluded. Death by spacing, the same fate he had inflicted on 2,000 innocent humans. The execution would be carried out immediately, but first, the Saurian would watch as Earth announced its new policy regarding alien aggression against human civilians. The Department of Galactic Justice was established with unlimited authority to hunt down war criminals anywhere in the galaxy. Every being who had participated in attacks against human civilians would be tracked down and brought to trial regardless of how long it took or where they tried to hide. There would be no statute of limitations and no safe havens for those who chose to make war on humanity. Clark was promoted to admiral and given command of the expanding human fleet. His first assignment was to track down the remaining participants in the Kepler massacre using intelligence gathered from Thekmar's interrogation. The list contained 847 names of Saurian military personnel who had been directly or indirectly involved in the attack. The galaxy watched in fascination and growing horror as human ships began appearing throughout Saurian space. These were not invasion fleets seeking to conquer territory, but something far more terrifying: police forces, with the patience and resources to pursue individual criminals across interstellar distances. The message was clear to every species monitoring the situation. Humanity had learned that the galaxy contained predators who viewed them as prey. Their response was to become predators themselves, but with a difference that would reshape galactic politics forever. Other species fought for territory or resources that could be negotiated or shared. Humans fought for justice, and justice was not something that could be bargained away. The Saurian Empire began to collapse as military officers resigned rather than risk being targeted by human hunters. Families fled to distant systems hoping to escape association with the Kepler massacre. The economy crashed as resources were diverted to hiding war criminals and protecting them from human justice. Ambassador Zektor paused in his testimony to the Galactic Coalition as representatives absorbed the full implications of what he was telling them. The humans had not simply won a war against the Saurian Empire, they had destroyed an entire civilization's will to fight by demonstrating that aggression against humanity would result in consequences that lasted generations. The years following Thekmar's execution became known in Saurian history as the Time of Hunters. Human ships appeared throughout the Empire with disturbing regularity, always seeking specific individuals rather than engaging in traditional warfare. These were not random raids, but surgical strikes targeting people whose names appeared on lists compiled by the Department of Galactic Justice. General Rex Thompson commanded the human forces responsible for tracking down mid-level officers who had celebrated the Discovery's destruction. His investigation teams spent months infiltrating Saurian society to locate targets who had assumed false identities or fled to remote colonies. The humans demonstrated a patience and thoroughness that terrified anyone who might have reason to fear them. Commander Silnath had been Thekmar's second-in-command during the Kepler massacre. After his superior's capture, Silnath had abandoned his military career and fled to a neutral trading station where he operated a small shipping business under an assumed name. For 3 years, he lived quietly and believed he had escaped the consequences of his actions. Thompson's teams tracked Silnath through financial records, cargo manifests, and surveillance footage from dozens of star systems. They built a complete picture of his new life, including his business associates, daily routines, and security arrangements. When they finally moved to capture him, the operation was swift and precise. The Saurian commander was taken from his office in broad daylight, while station security watched helplessly. Human agents had provided evidence of his true identity to local authorities along with formal extradition requests. Silnath found himself shipped back to human space in chains, while his business partners discovered they had been unknowingly harboring a war criminal. The psychological impact of these captures extended far beyond the immediate targets. Saurian military families lived in constant fear that human hunters might appear at any moment seeking relatives who had served during the massacre. Officers, who had been junior crew members 50 years ago, now held important positions in government and industry, making them valuable targets for human justice. Captain Linda Rodriguez specialized in operations that demonstrated humanity's new approach to warfare. When her intelligence teams identified a Saurian military base that had provided logistical support for Thekmar's fleet, she did not attack with overwhelming force. Instead, she presented the base commander with a list of personnel who needed to surrender for trial. The confrontation lasted only 6 hours. Rodriguez offered simple terms: hand over the 17 individuals on her list, and everyone else could return to their duties unharmed. Refuse, and human forces would take the base by storm and search for the targets themselves. The base commander chose to protect his innocent personnel rather than risk a battle he could not win. This became the standard human procedure for dealing with Saurian military installations. Instead of fighting entire units, the humans focused on specific individuals, while offering amnesty to everyone else. Saurian commanders found themselves forced to choose between protecting war criminals and saving their own soldiers from unnecessary casualties. The economic consequences for the Saurian Empire proved almost as devastating as the military pressure. Trade partners began avoiding Saurian space to prevent accidental encounters with human hunter fleets. Insurance companies refused to cover cargo shipments to systems where humans might be operating. The Empire's currency weakened as investors lost confidence in government stability. Admiral Hayes expanded the human fleet annually as more names were added to the Justice Department's wanted lists. The original 847 targets had grown to include support personnel, intelligence officers, and civilian officials who had been involved in planning or approving the massacre. Each investigation uncovered new participants who required tracking and capture. Dr. Sarah Collins led the forensic teams responsible for identifying Saurian war criminals through biological and technological evidence. Human scientists had developed genetic analysis techniques that could identify individuals from microscopic tissue samples found on Discovery wreckage. This evidence provided legal justification for pursuing targets who thought they had left no trace of their involvement. The most disturbing aspect of human operations was their unlimited patience. Traditional wars ended when one side achieved victory or negotiated peace, but the humans showed no interest in either outcome. They would continue hunting war criminals for as long as necessary, regardless of diplomatic pressure or military threats from other species. Saurian Ambassador Zektor had been a young diplomat during the Kepler incident with no involvement in military operations. He watched his civilization slowly disintegrate under the weight of human justice while being powerless to stop the process. Every attempt at negotiation was rejected with the same response: surrender the remaining war criminals and the hunting would stop. The Empire's military strength evaporated as experienced officers retired rather than risk being targeted by human hunters. Recruitment dropped to critical levels as young Saurians refused to join forces that might make them enemies of humanity. Within a decade, the once proud Saurian fleet was reduced to a defensive force barely capable of protecting their core systems. Cultural changes proved even more profound than military ones. Saurian schools began teaching students about the Kepler incident as an example of how aggressive foreign policy could destroy entire civilizations. Parents warned their children never to volunteer for military service that might involve contact with humans. The species that had once celebrated Thekmar's victory now viewed it as the greatest disaster in their history. Human hunter fleets established permanent bases throughout former Saurian territory, turning conquest worlds into monitoring stations. These facilities served as launching points for operations against remaining targets, while demonstrating that humanity intended to maintain pressure indefinitely. The message was clear to every species in the galaxy. Attacking human civilians would result in consequences that lasted generations. By the time of Ambassador Zektor's testimony to the Galactic Coalition, human forces had captured or killed 835 of the original 847 war criminals identified in the Kepler investigation. Only 12 individuals remained at large, and human intelligence services were actively tracking their locations. The hunt would continue until the last participant in the massacre was brought to justice. The Saurian Empire had effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. Their military was crippled, their economy was in ruins, and their population lived in constant fear of human retaliation. What had once been a proud interstellar civilization was now a cautionary tale about the price of underestimating humanity's capacity for revenge. Commander Velnari and other coalition representatives listened to Zektor's testimony with growing unease. The mathematical calculations that had seemed so compelling before now appeared to miss the most important factor in any conflict with humans. Technology and numbers meant nothing when facing an enemy that would never stop fighting until justice was served. The ambassador concluded his historical account with a simple warning that would echo through the coalition chambers for years to come. The humans had proven that they possessed something more dangerous than advanced weapons or superior tactics. They had demonstrated an absolute refusal to accept defeat or forget injustice, making them the most feared species in known space. The coalition chambers remained silent for several minutes after Ambassador Zektor finished his testimony. Representatives from 12 different species processed what they had heard about humanity's response to the Kepler massacre. The mathematical certainty that had driven their earlier discussions now seemed less reliable in light of the Saurian Empire's complete collapse. Commander Velnari was the first to break the silence, though her crystalline voice carried less confidence than before. She acknowledged that the Saurian experience had been unfortunate, but argued that their situation was fundamentally different. The ethereal collective possessed superior technology and tactical doctrine that would prevent the prolonged conflict that had destroyed their reptilian allies. Her analysis focused on the key weaknesses she had identified in human military operations. The Department of Galactic Justice required enormous resources to maintain hunter fleets across multiple star systems. Human forces were spread thin, pursuing individual targets rather than concentrated for major battles. A swift, coordinated strike could eliminate their scattered ships before they could respond effectively. Elder Mordak supported Velnari's assessment with intelligence reports from the hive mind's extensive spy network. Human colonies were lightly defended while most of their fleet was engaged in hunting operations. A surprise attack on Earth itself could decapitate human leadership before they could organize their characteristic long-term response. The insectoid elder presented tactical projections showing how 6 coalition fleets could overwhelm human defenses through coordinated strikes. Unlike the Saurians who had faced humanity alone, the coalition possessed the numbers and firepower to achieve decisive victory. Mathematical models predicted complete human defeat within 6 months of the initial attack. Dr. Keth Ara from the Cerebral Union provided psychological analysis supporting the military arguments. His research indicated that humans required emotional motivation to sustain their aggressive behavior, remove their leadership, and destroy their home system, and the remaining scattered forces would lose the will to fight effectively. The scholarly alien argued that human persistence was actually a weakness that could be exploited. Their refusal to accept defeat meant they would waste resources on hopeless causes rather than negotiating rational settlements. A sufficiently devastating initial attack would force them to recognize the futility of resistance. Ambassador Zektor listened to these arguments with growing alarm. These representatives were making the exact same mistakes that had doomed his people 50 years earlier. They were analyzing human capabilities based on conventional military thinking while ignoring the psychological factors that made humanity truly dangerous. The Saurian diplomat requested permission to share additional, classified information about recent human activities. His intelligence services had been monitoring Earth's response to coalition military buildup, and what they had discovered should concern every species considering aggressive action against humanity. High Chancellor Kixrun granted his request despite objections from the War faction. The Chamber's attention focused on Zektor as he prepared to reveal intelligence that would change the nature of their debate. The humans had not been idle during the decades since the Kepler incident, and their preparations for larger conflicts would shock coalition planners. Zektor began by describing the massive expansion of human industrial capacity over the past 20 years. Earth's orbital shipyards now produced more warships annually than the entire coalition combined. These vessels were specifically designed for extended operations far from human territory, suggesting that Earth was preparing for conflicts that might last decades. More disturbing was the evidence of human colonization patterns in recently settled systems. What appeared to be civilian settlements were actually disguised military bases capable of supporting large fleets indefinitely. The humans had learned from the Saurian experience and were ensuring that their forces could never be cut off from supply lines. The ambassador shared reconnaissance data showing human technological advancement since their first encounters with alien races. Earth's scientists had reverse-engineered captured Saurian equipment and improved upon it with modifications that exploited weaknesses in coalition designs. Human weapons were no longer primitive projectile systems, but sophisticated energy weapons optimized for penetrating alien defenses. Perhaps most troubling was the evidence of human intelligence operations throughout coalition space. Zektor presented communications intercepts proving that Earth's agents had infiltrated government and military organizations across multiple species. The humans knew about coalition battle plans almost as soon as they were developed. Commander Velnari dismissed this intelligence as Saurian propaganda designed to prevent coalition action that might threaten their remaining territories. She argued that Zektor was exaggerating human capabilities to protect his own people from further retaliation. The evidence was circumstantial and could be interpreted in multiple ways. Elder Mordak agreed that the intelligence was questionable, pointing out that the Saurians had obvious motivation to discourage coalition military action. The hive mind's own analysis suggested that human expansion was still limited by population and resource constraints that made them vulnerable to coordinated attack. The debate continued for hours as representatives argued about the reliability of Saurian intelligence and the implications for coalition policy. Some members began to waver in their support for military action, but the War faction maintained that swift, decisive strikes could prevent the prolonged conflict that had destroyed the Saurian Empire. Dr. Kethara presented psychological profiles, suggesting that humans required time to build emotional motivation for their characteristic persistence. A surprise attack that achieved immediate victory would deny them the opportunity to develop the emotional investment necessary for long-term resistance. The key was to act quickly before humans could form attachments to their new colonies. Ambassador Zektor made one final desperate plea to the assembled representatives. He revealed that his own government had authorized him to share their most closely guarded secret about human psychology. The Department of Galactic Justice was not simply a military organization, but something far more dangerous to galactic civilization. The humans had weaponized their sense of justice itself, turning what other species considered an abstract concept into a practical tool for warfare. They fought not for territory or resources, but for principles that could never be captured or destroyed. This made them fundamentally different from every other species in known space. High Chancellor Kixron called for final statements before the vote. The chamber fell silent as representatives prepared to make their decision about humanity's fate. Commander Velnari rose to deliver her closing argument, confident that logic and military analysis would prevail over Saurian fear-mongering. She reminded the coalition that they faced a critical decision about the future balance of power in the galaxy. Human expansion would eventually threaten every member species unless it was stopped now, while they were still relatively weak. The mathematics of the situation remained unchanged, regardless of Saurian propaganda. Ambassador Zektor delivered his final warning with the weight of 50 years of experience. The Coalition could choose to attack humanity and face the same fate as the Saurian Empire, or they could learn from history and find diplomatic solutions. But if they chose war, they should be prepared for consequences that would last for generations. The vote was called with representatives casting their decisions electronically to maintain secrecy. High Chancellor Kixran announced the results. Moments later, 8 species voted for military action while 4 voted against. The Coalition would authorize preemptive strikes against human expansion to contain the threat before it grew beyond control. Commander Velnari accepted command of the Joint Coalition fleet with confidence that superior technology and numbers would achieve swift victory. She began immediate planning for coordinated strikes against human colonies and military installations. The war that would reshape galactic civilization was about to begin. Commander Velnari established her headquarters aboard the massive Coalition flagship Unified Destiny, a joint construction project that represented the best technology from 6 different species. The ship's weapon systems could devastate planetary surfaces, while its shields could withstand concentrated fire from entire fleets. Nothing in human space approached its capabilities. The Coalition fleet assembled at Nexus Prime consisted of 847 warships from 8 member species, each contributing their most advanced vessels to the campaign. Ethereal collective energy weapons, hive mind swarm tactics, and cerebral union targeting systems would combine to create an unstoppable force. Mathematical projections showed that human defenses would collapse within days of the initial assault. Admiral Susan Hayes received intelligence reports about Coalition fleet movements while reviewing the latest updates from Department of Galactic Justice operations. The timing was unfortunate, since most of her experienced commanders were engaged in hunting the remaining Saurian war criminals. However, Earth's defensive preparations had been designed for exactly this scenario. The human response to Coalition aggression would follow doctrine developed through decades of studying alien military tactics. Instead of trying to match enemy technology or numbers, Earth's forces would exploit the one advantage that no alien species seemed to understand: humanity's complete refusal to accept defeat under any circumstances. Hayes activated emergency protocols that had been prepared since the first contact with hostile aliens. Every human colony received orders to implement scorched earth policies if invaded, denying Coalition forces any useful resources or intelligence. Civilian populations would evacuate to hidden shelters while military forces prepared for guerrilla warfare that could last indefinitely. The Department of Galactic Justice began compiling detailed files on every Coalition officer involved in planning the attack. Names, service records, family connections, and personal histories were gathered from human intelligence networks throughout alien space. When the war ended, these individuals would face trial for crimes against humanity, regardless of which side claimed victory. Captain Mike Torres commanded the human fleet protecting the Outer Rim colonies where Coalition forces were expected to strike first. His ships were outnumbered 10-1, but they carried weapons specifically designed to exploit weaknesses in alien technology. More importantly, they were crewed by veterans who understood that retreat was not an option when fighting for human survival. The Coalition attack began at dawn on 12 different human colonies simultaneously. Velnari's strategy was to overwhelm human defenses through coordinated strikes that prevented effective response. Each target was assigned overwhelming force to ensure quick victory and minimize Coalition casualties. The first phase proceeded exactly as Coalition planners had predicted. Human orbital defenses were destroyed by massed energy weapon fire, while invasion forces landed to secure strategic objectives. Resistance was lighter than expected, since most human military units seemed to have evacuated before the attacks began. Elder. Mordak reported successful landings on all targeted worlds within 6 hours of the initial assault. Coalition forces encountered minimal opposition while securing spaceports, communication centers, and government facilities. Human civilian populations appeared to have fled to remote areas, leaving behind empty cities and abandoned infrastructure. Commander. Velnari was pleased with the operation's progress, but concerned about the lack of serious resistance. Intelligence had predicted that humans would fight desperately to defend their colonies, yet coalition forces were advancing against token opposition. The enemy seemed to be implementing some kind of strategic withdrawal rather than defending their territory. The first indication that something was wrong came when coalition landing forces attempted to access human computer systems. Every database had been wiped clean while all manufacturing facilities had been systematically destroyed. The humans had abandoned their colonies but left nothing useful behind for the invaders. Captain Torres launched his counterattack 3 days after the initial coalition landings. Human ships emerged from hiding places throughout the asteroid belts and began striking isolated enemy vessels. These were not conventional battles, but hit-and-run raids designed to inflict maximum casualties while avoiding decisive engagement. The human tactics proved devastatingly effective against coalition forces that had expected traditional warfare. Alien commanders found their ships being picked off one by enemies that appeared without warning and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. The mathematical advantage of superior numbers meant nothing when those numbers could not be brought to bear effectively. Dr. Kethara analyzed human behavior patterns and reported his findings to Commander Velnari with growing concern. The aliens were not fighting to defend territory or resources, but were implementing a strategy designed to make occupation impossible. Every coalition victory was immediately followed by guerrilla attacks that made the conquest meaningless. Worse, human forces showed no interest in negotiating or accepting defeat, despite suffering heavy casualties. Coalition psychological warfare had no effect on enemies who seemed genuinely prepared to die rather than surrender. The mathematical models that had predicted human collapse were proving completely inaccurate. The turning point came when coalition forces attempted to use captured human civilians as hostages to force military surrender. Admiral Hayes's response was broadcast throughout the galaxy and would become one of the most famous speeches in human history. Earth would accept no negotiations while alien forces occupied human territory, regardless of the cost in civilian lives. The Admiral's message continued with a declaration that shocked alien listeners. Any coalition species that participated in attacks on human civilians would face the same justice as the Saurians. The Department of Galactic Justice was already compiling evidence of war crimes committed during the invasion, and those responsible would be hunted down regardless of how long it took. Commander Velnari realized that the coalition had made a fundamental error in their understanding of human psychology. These aliens did not fight for victory in any conventional sense, but for abstract principles that could never be captured or destroyed. Territory meant nothing to them if the principles behind that territory remained intact. The coalition fleet began suffering serious losses as human forces expanded their guerrilla campaign. Ships that had been invincible in conventional battles proved vulnerable to enemies that ignored conventional tactics. More disturbing was the psychological impact on coalition crews who found themselves being hunted by adversaries that seemed impossible to defeat permanently. Elder Mordak requested permission to negotiate with human forces after losing half of his ships to hit-and-run attacks. The hive mind's collective consciousness was being damaged by the stress of fighting an enemy that refused to follow logical patterns. His people needed to end this conflict before it caused permanent psychological damage to their species. Commander Velnari rejected all suggestions of negotiation, arguing that coalition forces simply needed to adapt their tactics to deal with human guerrilla warfare. However, her own confidence was beginning to waver as reports arrived of human hunter fleets appearing throughout coalition space. The enemy was already implementing their characteristic long-term response to aggression. Admiral Hayes's strategy was becoming clear to anyone who studied the pattern of human operations. Earth would not seek quick victory through conventional battles, but would instead make the cost of occupying human territory higher than any possible benefit. More importantly, they would ensure that every coalition species involved in the war would face consequences lasting generations. The galaxy watched in fascination as the conflict developed along lines that alien military analysts had not predicted. Coalition forces were winning every battle while simultaneously losing the war to an enemy that redefined what victory meant. The humans were teaching the universe a new form of warfare based on principles rather than territory. 6 months after the Coalition's initial attack, Commander Velnari stood in the wreckage of what had once been her flagship's bridge. Human boarding parties had systematically destroyed every critical system while capturing her entire command. Staff for transport to Earth. The unified destiny, pride of Coalition engineering, was now nothing more than a drifting tomb filled with the bodies of her crew. The final battle had lasted 18 hours as human forces demonstrated tactics that defied every principle of conventional warfare. Instead of seeking to destroy the Coalition fleet, they had focused on capturing key personnel while allowing damaged ships to escape. The message was clear. Humans wanted prisoners for their trials, not just military victory. Admiral Hayes personally conducted Velnari's interrogation aboard the human command ship UES Justice. The crystalline alien found herself facing questions about every coalition officer who had participated in planning the invasion. Human intelligence had compiled detailed files on thousands of individuals who would soon face charges of crimes against humanity. The interrogation revealed the scope of human preparations for this conflict. Earth's agents had been monitoring Coalition communications for years, providing advance warning of the attack and detailed intelligence about enemy capabilities. More importantly, they had identified every individual involved in planning or supporting aggressive action against human colonies. Velnari learned that her own family members were already being hunted by human forces throughout ethereal collective space. Her sister, a civilian scientist who had provided technical support for Coalition weapons, was wanted for trial as a war criminal. The humans made no distinction between military and civilian participants in actions against their people. The Coalition. Fleet's remnants scattered across the galaxy as ship after ship was hunted down by human forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. Captain Torres had expanded his guerrilla tactics to include deep strikes into alien territory, demonstrating that nowhere in known space was safe from human retaliation. Elder Mordak surrendered his remaining forces after losing contact with the hive mind's collective consciousness. The psychological trauma of fighting humans had damaged his species' mental networks beyond repair. Entire colonies of his people were becoming catatonic as they struggled to process the concept of an enemy that could not be defeated through logical means. The Cerebral Union withdrew from the Coalition entirely after Dr. Cathara was captured during a raid on his research facility. His psychological profiles of human behavior had been used to plan the invasion, making him a priority target for the Department of Galactic Justice. The Scholars' Trial would demonstrate that even civilian support for military action against humans carried consequences. News of the Coalition's defeat spread throughout the galaxy faster than official communications could suppress it. Neutral species that had been considering their own expansion into human territory immediately canceled all such plans. The mathematical certainty that had driven Coalition decision-making was revealed as a fatal misunderstanding of human psychology. Ambassador Zektor addressed an emergency session of what remained of the Coalition with grim satisfaction. His warnings had been ignored, and now 8 species faced the same fate that had destroyed the Saurian Empire. The humans would spend the next several decades hunting down everyone involved in the invasion, regardless of rank or species. The economic Impact of human retaliation began immediately as trade routes through coalition space were declared off-limits to human commerce. Earth's growing economic influence meant that other species had to choose between human trade and coalition membership. Most chose to maintain relations with the species that controlled increasingly vital shipping lanes. Admiral Hayes announced the establishment of new Department of Galactic Justice offices throughout former coalition territory. These facilities would coordinate the hunt for war criminals while demonstrating human commitment to pursuing justice regardless of the time and resources required. The message to other species was unmistakable. Attacking humans carried consequences that lasted generations. Captain Torres found himself promoted to admiral as Earth expanded its military forces to deal with multiple ongoing operations. The human fleet now included ships specifically designed for long-range pursuit missions, capable of operating independently for years while hunting individual targets across interstellar distances. The trials of coalition leadership began on Earth 6 months after the war's end, broadcast throughout the galaxy to demonstrate human concepts of justice. Commander Velnari faced charges for the murder of 40,000 human civilians during the invasion, while Elder Mordak was accused of genocide for his species' assault on human colonies. Each trial followed the same pattern established during the Saurian proceedings: detailed presentation of evidence, testimony from human survivors, and formal sentencing for crimes against humanity. The aliens were given every opportunity to defend their actions, but military orders provided no excuse for attacks on civilian populations. The executions were carried out with the same cold efficiency that characterized all human military operations. There were no speeches or ceremonies, just the systematic elimination of individuals who had chosen to make war on human civilians. The galaxy watched and learned that humanity's concept of justice was as implacable as their military campaigns. Dr. Sarah Collins expanded her forensic operations to process evidence from the coalition invasion. Her teams identified 12,000 individual aliens who had participated directly in attacks on human civilians. Each name was added to the Department of Galactic Justice database, along with detailed information about their current locations and activities. The hunt for coalition war criminals would continue for decades as human forces methodically tracked down every participant in the invasion. Unlike traditional wars that ended with peace treaties, this conflict would persist until the last guilty individual was brought to trial. The humans had redefined warfare itself by making it a permanent consequence of aggression. Species throughout the galaxy began modifying their military doctrines to account for humanity's unique approach to conflict. Traditional concepts like victory and defeat had become meaningless when fighting enemies who viewed war as a judicial process rather than a political tool. The humans had weaponized their own sense of justice. Admiral Hayes prepared for her next assignment: hunting down the architects of coalition policy who had authorized the invasion from their safe positions on distant worlds. These individuals believed that political authority protected them from consequences, but human justice recognized no such limitations. War crimes were personal responsibilities that could not be hidden behind government positions. The galaxy entered a new era where aggression against human interests carried risks that no species was willing to accept. Earth's growing influence extended far beyond their military capabilities to encompass economic, political, and psychological dominance over civilizations that had learned to fear human persistence. Ambassador Zektor concluded his address to the dissolved coalition with a simple observation that would be remembered throughout galactic history. Humanity had proven that some species were too dangerous to fight, not because of their strength, but because of their absolute refusal to accept defeat or forget injustice. In a universe of predators, humans had become the apex hunters. The warning that had begun 50 years earlier with the Kepler incident was now understood throughout known space. Do not attack the humans, because they will never let you escape. Justice, unlike victory, had no expiration date, and humanity would pursue it across the galaxy for as long as necessary. The age of human dominance had begun, built not on conquest, but on the simple principle that some crimes could never be forgiven or forgotten.